So today is the day that the torque tube seals came in. So I'm just going to jump right in and move on towards pulling the rear end out of the car, because that is a mandatory thing if you're ever going to get to the torque tube seals. So rather than dally about here, I'm going to jump right into where it begins with disconnecting the parking cable brake. It says here at the rear brake cable sheave and at the bracket on the front end of the torque tube. So I'm going to get underneath there and find those two connection places and get the parking cable disconnected. So I'm here on my side underneath the car and tracing the torque tube back. I can see this guy right here, which is a parking brake connection. This bracket is riveted to the torque tube. So I believe this kind of spring clip device here is going to have to pop off. And then I can disconnect the rigid back part here of the parking brake cable. There's bad lighting here. Yeah, it's hard for me to see everything at the same time, but the cable's got to disconnect there at that bracket. I think it's held in by that kind of funny shaped little clip right there. And then behind me, there's not much room under here, so there's another cable there. At least that's what the manual says, is go ahead and disconnect it back there and also here at the front. So I'm going to do some wrenching and put the camera down. No, start. Okay. So I got it started here with the screw with channel locks, and then I can get a screwdriver here and just pull this little clip guy out right here. So now the spring comes off. This little grommet's dead. And if I disconnect the cable at the other end, I'll be able to pull this whole cable assembly through. That's a rubber grommet there. So I got to work on disconnecting the other end real quick. Alright, by grabbing onto this end here with a pair of channel locks and getting a wrench on this end, you can see I've got this loosened up. I'm going to go ahead and remove this entirely. And probably we'll be able to take the whole cable out through that slot when I'm done. But I think I'm going to have to put the camera down to finish this out. So hang tight. So with that off, I can take the tension off of here and I can actually pull this whole thing off. So I'm going to do that, kind of reassemble these nuts and bolts together so I keep the order. It's good that I'm recording this anyway, and that way if I have questions about how this goes back when I'm done, I'll just refer back to my own video. I'll have to put the camera down again, but you can see that here on the other end, if I just pull this out, this whole cable's going to come out. So I'm going to do that first, put the camera down, and then we'll move on to the next steps. Okay, here we are again. Now it's time to move on to brakes. So not to get confused on you here, but there's like here's an X member of the frame versus the I think they call them strut supports or something like that in the manual here that connect to the torque tube. And the manual says disconnect the brakes. So here's a brake cable. Do it at the frame member here, and there's a retaining clip right here as well. So disconnect it, plug the end so you don't get crap in your brakes, and remove that retaining clip. And there's no way I can do this while holding the camera, so you're just going to have to hold on for a moment. So here's brake line disconnected and capped off with some plastic wrap and rubber bands so nothing gets in there. I had it wrong. Retaining clip is on this side, but as you can see, I've got it backed halfway off there. And I just got to get a screwdriver on there and get the rest of that off there, and I think that brake line will come off. Well, I was right. There is a big retaining clip on the other side here as well, pulled out with some channel locks, and now I think our hose will start to be able to come out here. There we are. Now I'm going to cap that off with some hose and or plastic wrap and rubber bands so don't get junk in there either, and move on. That's the brakes disconnected. So the number of steps next actually isn't too far from getting ready to remove the rear end. You have to remove the torque tube nuts or bolts at the torque tube flange. You have to disconnect the shock absorber arms, and it says there's a radius rod on there as well. So I'll check out to see which specific suspension component they're talking about there. But after that, you disconnect the rear springs, and they're left-handed threads, it says, or left-handed bolts. Then hoist the rear end of the car high enough to just roll the rear axle assembly out from under the car. So I think what this means is I'm actually going to have to put the vehicle back on the ground and then disconnect the springs and then raise the rear of the car up and just try to, it says here, roll the rear axle assembly out from under the car. So let's see how this actually works out. Alright, it's a new day. Sorry for the upside down camera work, but there's not much room for me to move around underneath here since we're just barely up on jack stands for a ways. But torque tube ball, these are the bolts that I'm going to wind up taking off. I think there's a tube right here that I think is a breather tube. I'm going to check this out. There's a little bit of fluid coming out from underneath there, so I don't know. Hopefully that's not. I'd be sorely disappointed if that was a source of loss of fluid and it wasn't the torque tube ball. But there's some drip here. This is quite greasy throughout here, and there's a pretty high chance that this is certainly a good possible source of the leak. It's red-ish. It's got the viscosity of transmission fluid. So let's hope that that's the case here. So next steps, I believe, are to remove these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 torque tube bolts right here. Very quick shout out to Wobblehead socket. Not really sure that these top bolts behind this torque tube here would have been accessible very easily without it. Anyway, thank you, Wobblehead. I guess to pass on some knowledge to anybody else who's taken one of these off, it is a good idea to take the top ones off first. Because when you get to the bottom ones, they bind up a little bit more because now the weight of the torque tube is kind of sagging down on it. So here's one of these examples where it's better to work with the hard bolts first, the ones that are up and out of sight, get those removed, and then do the easy ones you can see at the end. And we're starting to drip a little bit as I take that last bolt out there, so I've got a bucket underneath here in case a bunch of fluid starts to come out the tube there. The tube actually angles backwards downhill towards the differential, so hopefully it doesn't just gush a bunch of stuff out. Just want to take out that last bolt. We'll see. Alright, tubes are flange bolts, they're removed. I was actually able to pull the torque tube back just a little bit. There's some play there with the shock absorber arms and the spring back there, but we're separated. And now I'm going to move back there. The shock absorber links come out, and then the left-hand thread springs come out, and then I think the whole rear is supposed to come loose after that. So let's get back there and do that. They don't state it explicitly in the manual, but I think the order of operation that we're going to do here is that I'm going to have these wheels on the ground. Right now they're lifted up and it's putting strain on the springs and the shock absorber arm and that radius rod right there. But later on, towards the end, they're like, once everything's disconnected, the manual says to continue to raise the rear end of the car up and roll the unit out as an assembly. So I'm going to make the assumption then that though I may loosen, get started some of these nuts here and bolts, I should say, while the car is up. When it comes time to removing them, I'm going to drop the car down and have not quite as much stress on the springs, which are being sprung downward right now. I certainly don't want to release the bolt and have that go shooting back up. want to see if I can't find kind of a happy sweet spot where there isn't quite as much strain on the suspension with the wheels on the ground. Once I've got these bolts started at least, and then finish removing them, once everything's disconnected, then I'll actually get a couple jack stands out, and I'll just start raising the body up off at the frame rail higher and higher to see what I can get away with rolling this rear axle out. The exhaust there looks like it might be a little bit of a pain. That might get in the way a little bit. We'll have to see. Here's just what the radius rod looks like there, but I do have I see I've got a nut and quite a bit of threads on the back end there. It's actually fairly clean looking, so I'll get up the 1/2-inch sockets here and wrenches, and we'll just see what we can do with that. I'll scrub that down a little too, just to make sure. And I'll get a little more penetrating oil on that so that everything's as lubey as what we can get it. Alright, the radius rod was just a long bolt, and it was actually, I could tell by the way it was loosening up, it was under less pressure than what I thought, so I went ahead and removed it, even though I haven't dropped the wheels down yet. But I think I'm to the point now here where I'm going to go ahead and loosen up and see if I can get started the spring retaining nut, just get it loosened, and then drop the wheels down and take some pressure off of those springs a little bit. So that went real nice. There's a right underneath through here you can get a big socket and an extension on there, and I was able to get both of them left and right spring nuts loosened and going, and they absolutely were left-hand thread, so I'm glad I got the manual to alert me to that. I can't imagine somebody somewhere in the world has had a very bad day not being told or not knowing that those are left-hand threads retaining those. So I've already got the car on a couple of hydraulic jacks there, and I'm going to go ahead, and I got the jack stands removed and back, and I'm going to drop the car down onto the wheels a little bit, take some of the pressure off of those springs, and then see if I can get the rest of the nut and bolt separated off of the spring. And then we'll start playing around to see if we can actually lift up and back up and get the rear end out. Alright, we got the car down with the wheels resting kind of lightly on the concrete here. I'm gonna disconnect the rest of those shock absorber links right there, and then we'll get to taking out that last bit of the spring retainer there. I can tell that I really haven't taken all the pressure off the spring, but then again, if I'm coming in from the bottom and with a wrench sticking out from the side, if it does pop up, I don't think it's going to do too much, and it will relieve a little bit of tension as that screw gets taken out and the threads start to back off. So I've got one side really loosened up here. Actually, now this kind of a cap nut thing is now just spinning right here, so I'm having to put these vice grips on here to keep this cap nut assembly from spinning while I'm taking the last few threads out. Phew. There it is, that's the nut out. Wound up having to put on some vice grips onto this cap nut assembly here, and it turns out that just having the wheels touching the ground, but with the car still supported, as you can see over there on the jack stands, that's about the right tension on the springs to go ahead and release them. And it was a workout. It did not go easy, that's for sure, so no use complaining. Let's get on the other side and see how it goes. So we had a problem develop, and this could be potentially quite bad. On that cup that is still on that spring right there, that middle nut thing right there, and it's not even a nut, it's a strange piece of round metal with one flat side on it, spun out, broke out from the cup, and is now just spinning freely on the other end of the bolt that stabs through it, I guess from the bottom. So bolt comes up through there and through that cup right there, and it is just spinning. That is a serious problem, because the only way I can get on it is with a crescent wrench or a flat type wrench, and it is seriously bound up, or was very seriously bound up at the very end of the bolt Of course, that end of the bolt is where all the rust and the serious corrosion has happened, and of course that is a cup, so all these years, water and other things tends to pool in there, so it gets a little bit weakened. There is no great way, because this cup will only go up very, very little, even at its loosest point. I would not be able to get a blade through here, I don't think, under that cup to cut the bolt. And this bolt that, oh goodness, is way up in there, so there's not even a really good way to try to just cut off the head of the bolt or anything like that. So I was able, fortunately, to retighten that bolt, and this is a left-handed thread bolt, which is another level of complication on this. So I was able to retighten it, which means the top of it is now re-exposed pretty well. I can't even show it to you here very well, but I think if I'll probably remove the tire just so I can get some more room, and if I clean, and I mean just clean on the end of that bolt until it is Nubian clean, I believe I'll have enough grip with that crescent wrench to go ahead and still get on it enough to back it all the way through. And then I guess once that's apart, I will clean up this cup and bolt and probably tack weld it back in place or do something to kind of get my part back together, because that cup and bolt are a unit. But this has been kind of a serious setback. I wasted quite a bit of time yesterday just getting to the point where I could get on it and then get that bolt screwed back in to where I could clean it more. Let's hope that I can get on it pretty easy today. Clean, and have some success at grabbing on just enough to get that bolt backed all the way out. What's even more annoying is even once I have it backed out, the temptation would be to go ahead and chase out the threads and clean everything up, but these are left-handed threads, so I don't think I would literally probably have to get a special one-off tap and die for that size bolt if I wanted to try to do that. I think if I just de-rust them really good, I'll have it back though. Let's get to wrenching and hope for the best for me. Alright, I've been scrubbing, and I got the tire off, which is why, I don't know if this will show up very good or not here, but anyway, I can at least see what I'm doing a lot better with that tire off. I should be able to get on there with this crescent wrench, and let's hope that with some gentle prodding I'll be able to get that out. Oh my goodness, this is in a bad spot. Sweet Jesus, success. Alright, we got that sucker out, and as you can see, what I mean by broken loose is that was just spinning free in there. So you can picture being on the other side of that bolt trying to get some grip, and it's just spinning freely, and there being no way. I mean, this would have been bad. If this had gotten on there and I could not have gotten that out or found a way to back that back up and clean that bolt up a bit. I don't know what the next steps might have been. Could have been, well, I'd say Sawzall, but you couldn't get it on anything with the hacksaw blade. Maybe you could do some cutting with a torch. That would have been ugly. Cutting springs. I don't know what's happened. I don't know what would happen there. But let's just not even talk about that. Let's just clean these parts up here. I'll probably just tack weld this guy back in place somewhere, and keep using the original part. It's actually not rusted through as bad as what I thought. It just lost its grip right there where it was originally pressed in, or whatever type of fabrication happened there. Alright, there's been some cleanup on some parts. Both of those plates are in timeout in the evaporust bucket until they have thought about themselves for a while. We'll get those cleaned up. I'll get that one plate replaced. Something tells me there's probably a special tool, a special socket head that goes on those plates there inside the springs. I have no idea. I may research that sometime another day. But anyway, it's time to, I had to raise that tire up there just to get it off, so now we will drop the differential again back onto the ground, completely clean up, and then do the process of trying to raise the rear end of the car up enough to see if we can actually slide this rear end out. So we're up off the springs. You can see they're just kind of hanging here. So now I need to kind of start moving this torque tube around and seeing if I can get it. It may have to just be off the springs before it starts to roll back. I don't know if that torque tube can really bind up in there when it's coming out or not, but let's see if we can get it to come back. So just FYI, I lowered it back down the body till it was just off the springs, and that seems to be a happier place for the torque tube and the rear to start rolling out. But this will take a little bit of physical effort here, so I'm going to wind up stopping video for a while. I'll wind up pulling back the differential here, maybe about 5 inches or so. There's about more than 5 inches of support up in front at the end of the torque tube. What I don't want to happen is the whole torque tube and flange to come just flopping down on the ground and maybe bend the flange or anything like that. I'd like to have a little more control over this. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. So I've got the front of the car up on some jack stands, which might be changing my angle, making a sharper angle there between the transmission and the torque tube. So I'm going to drop the front end down onto the wheels, get the car a little lower up front, and see if that doesn't make it a little easier for me to remove the rear axle, because it's kind of binding up a little bit. I mean, it's sliding back and forth, and then it just kind of binds at the last moment. So let's see what happens. So having the car off the jack stands at the front, being a little lower in front, raising the back end of the car, but also putting a third jack underneath the differential and lifting up on the differential to control the height a little better, seemed to work better because I now have the torque tube pulled, or the whole rear axle has been pulled back and is now separated by about 1 inch from the transmission entirely. So I think I'm going to see if I can't lower this back down on the ground, and then see if we can't leave the wheels on the ground and try to use that to roll back. It was kind of binding up a little bit, and I can't tell if that was a wheel not liking going back in reverse on the drums versus a torque tube bind through the hole that it goes through up there. But anyway, we're separated from the transmission, so I know that whatever angling I do won't be putting any pressure on the transmission, which I feel better about. And there's a pretty generous hole cut through there for that torque tube and flange to get through. So I think we have a lot of angle room here as well to go ahead and see about gently dropping this down and making sure our clearances are good, and see if we can't start the process of both rolling it back and raising the car high enough to clear everything. So just so that you can kind of see what I was looking at here, I am separated and pulled out from the torque tube entirely. And I don't know if I can put the light down well enough to show it all, but that's very free, so I think I'll be able to gently just kind of lift this up and pass it through this X member. Oh my goodness, there's no room, sorry. I have to pass it through that X member, through this hole right up through here, and then I'll lay it down and see if we can't. I've got a pan right here to catch any fluid if something comes out, plus it'll keep that, wouldn't feel good at all about that end just laying on the ground and dragging, although probably the flange will carry the weight before you hit the concrete on that, but certainly don't want to damage that, so let's be careful. Okay, we're doing good. We're back as far as we can go before the tires start to hit the fender well there, so it's a matter of raising the car up high enough that the wheels will clear that. Supposedly it can be done, so I'll try that, and if I run out of clearance or things get weird, I'll have to take the tires off and lay it down on the differential and take it out that way. Hooray! Rear end successfully pulled out of 1950 Buick Roadmaster. Not exactly easy. But anyway, let's start checking out the other parts that we wanted to get to just for taking out the rear end in general. Well, so here we have fluid and oil. I am going to assume that this is actually, could very well be, it's pretty high viscosity. That feels like more like a gear oil. It could be blended with some transmission fluid. I have no idea. It did not immediately gush out, but now it's here. So anyway, I'm going to get something underneath that so we don't continue to have more mess. And we'll try to figure out what we have going on here with torque ball seal and torque ball in general. So here is the end of the torque ball. So I'm assuming that this little guy right here, I keep wiping it off. I see a little bit of seepage coming out from there. That may be a seal. I have two seals in the kit I've got. One that looks like a standard oil seal to me. I don't know about this. I don't know if this is going to show up very well. Somebody's been hammering on that underside a little bit. Perhaps when they were trying to install the original seal, I don't know. Go on, Dale. I keep looking instead of looking at the camera here, sorry. But anyway, right underneath there's been some, there's been a little bit of hammering done here. I can feel that it's been flattened there a little too, so maybe they're having some difficulty getting that seal on there originally. But anyway, you'll see when I have the other parts out in front of you, I believe this thrust plate will come off. There's other bolts that continue on the top, and you basically get this ball installed, and you shim it up and tighten up those bolts. And I believe that is your seal right there. Now what confuses me a little bit is that this is a rotating shaft. So I really can't picture this being the greatest, ever being the greatest seal around that shaft. I'll have to look and see what else is in there when you start to assemble it, but it's not so awesome of a connection right there, at least at first glance. Definitely perhaps a weak point. Maybe things will seem clearer to me once I've gotten this torque ball off and I've got it laid out in front of me. And then of course, to understand, you'd have to see the seal package that I got as well. But anyway, let's stop filming under here and let's go look at a diagram of the end of the torque tube as well and the propeller shaft that fits in there. So here's the seal kit that you get. You get one, which to me is a standard oil seal. This is like what you do on your front wheel bearings, nothing really different there. And then another little kind of toothed seal. It's kind of rubbery. Now I'm reading through my book here in a couple different places. Here's a picture of the end of your torque ball. Here's much elaboration about using a special installing plug to get that seal on there just right, because the original one was leather. Store it in neat's foot oil, it said, and you know, carefully put it on and lubricate everything, so on and so forth. So, you know, that seal right there is very important, and I'm sure that is the one that if it leaks, probably that is what allows transmission fluid to escape either directly out or into your torque tube. So I may actually, while it's off there, I may actually run the car and put it in some gears and see if some stuff starts to come out the back. That might be an interesting test to see how well it's leaking. Now what you have over here is a spring, another retainer, and little grungy bits of what was a seal. Probably, considering the way it fits and the way it lines up, that seal. That I pulled, this little assembly right here, I pulled off of the end of the torque tube propeller shaft. Not the torque ball one that's on the car, but this is on the whole rear assembly that I just took out and wheeled out. this slides over the end, and then this presses against the metal side, and then there's a seal that gets pushed forward. And you can see that diagram here. So here's the end of your propeller shaft of your torque tube that you just took off, a spring retainer, a spring, a seal cap, and a seal. So probably some of the drip that I think I saw back there was just leakage back past the torque tube. Perhaps up against this seal here, which is just non-existent. I mean, it doesn't show as well in the camera as what I like, but if I had a tool, I mean, I'm just going to scrape some out. There's just little brown, crusty, flaky bits coming out there. They're hard as a rock. Don't know if that was leather originally or what that was, but that is probably what should be that guy right there. But that doesn't really answer the question for me of where is transmission fluid going, because I don't believe that this component here, these components here off of the end of this propeller shaft are in any way related to leaking out of your transmission. So I still, for my own sanity, want to make sure that this seal here is really, truly, and is intended for the back of the torque ball, or the last stand, so to speak, against transmission fluid from leaking out of the car. And it would be interesting to actually see the transmission spin and see if we actually start to see leakage around this seal underneath the car. So we might try that out in another video here. But I think I'm going to stop. I have limited time today. I'm going to have to wrap this up, and we'll contemplate what to do about the torque tube and this again later. Something else to consider is that I don't believe at all that there is not supposed to be, I know there's not supposed to be any fluid in the torque tube. So clearly, in addition, from the viscosity of the stuff that I saw coming out of the torque tube, I believe I have differential fluid leaking also into the torque tube, possibly commingling, not really sure, but it's not supposed to be there. So there may be some more sealing that I have to do with the differential. Probably I should do it, of course, now while it's off and easy to work on. So let's see where this winds up ending.